Hello and welcome to another episode of Her Entrepreneurial Rise, the podcast where we amplify the stories of women and gender-expansive leaders using entrepreneurship as a force for social change. Because their stories aren't just inspiring, they're blueprints for what's possible when equity leads the way. Today's episode brings you into a conversation I've been really looking forward to, one that speaks to both the innovation and the uncertainty that are part of building something meaningful. Joining me today is Frankie Shelton, a clinical nutritionist turned healthcare innovator whose work lives at the intersection of clinical insight, tech-driven solutions, and addressing critical gaps in care for underserved communities. With a special focus on women's health, particularly cardiovascular health, Frankie co-founded Her Heart a platform built to bring evidence-based, inclusive cardiovascular care to women often overlooked by mainstream health systems. But like many founders committed to solving complex systemic problems, Frankie and her team hit a pivotal crossroads earlier this summer and made the difficult decision to dissolve Her Heart in its current form. Here's where this conversation becomes especially important. We don't often hear from founders at these inflection points. We hear about the initial idea, we hear about the exit, but the middle, the real core of the entrepreneurial journey is messy, courageous, and deeply human. In today's episode, we'll talk with Frankie about what it means to be so close to a mission, to build something with love and intention, and also to know when to pause, pivot, or let go when the timing or traction just isn't right. And most importantly, we'll get into how to keep showing up to solve the problem that first ignited your passion in the first place. Frankie, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, Kelen.
I'm so excited to get into this conversation today. So before we dive into the genesis of Her Heart I'd love to start by exploring your background as a clinical nutritionist and healthcare provider. I'm curious about what patterns or presentation of symptoms that you started to notice in your patients that made it clear to you that there was a gap in women's healthcare, specifically around cardiovascular health.
Great question. So one of the things that I think I should kind of declare, and as we open the gate here, is that I think just by having women come to see a clinical nutritionist, oftentimes it's already a signal that there's gaps in other parts of their healthcare, whether that be through not getting the support that they're looking for in from their primary care provider, or not being able to get into another type of specialist that they may feel that they need. I think that clinical nutritionists or dietitians sometimes fill that gap in terms of having maybe a little bit more time for patient care, a little bit more specialty in terms of specific issues that women tend to face or deal with more often. And in my case, I was really focused on, as a clinical nutritionist, the intersection between hormonal health and digestive health. And those are two issues in women's health that really tend to be dismissed or downplayed in terms of not having a lot of solutions to offer in the primary care setting. And so when you think about a woman who has a hormonal issue or at any time in her lifespan, oftentimes there's a digestive issue kind of correlated to it, but maybe not necessarily identified. It's the same way, vice versa. We see a lot of digestive symptoms kind of rise to the surface. And then when we start to unpack those, we see that there's also hormonal symptoms as well. So I think that one of the things that I saw as a pattern in the women that were coming to me, sometimes they would think nutritionists because they were having digestive issues, but then we would actually start to work with their hormonal issues as well. And over time, I was a nutritionist for right around a decade. And in that period of time, the women that I saw most often were women 35 to 50, kind of in that midlife range where they maybe had finished their maternity journey or kind of that earlier phase of their hormonal journey. And they were not necessarily yet in menopause, but they were in this gray space between. And I started to see a lot of patterns of women during that time having difficulty getting access to care and getting access to solutions for the stacking symptoms that they were having.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting to think about, even you're into working as a clinical nutritionist, that you were already kind of working to fill the gaps that were being left by primary care or by the kind of mainstream health system. You were already interested in filling a need that wasn't being served. And then through that, acknowledged that, well, there's, for this particular subset of women, midlife women, there's a lot that's falling through the cracks in terms of how they're able to access care and the kinds of symptoms that they're experiencing, maybe a provider in the traditional healthcare space isn't necessarily aware of how to best serve those, as you mentioned, like stacking symptoms. Like there's so many things going on. Where do we start? Given that the healthcare system is overburdened in so many ways. Both my parents are doctors, so I know that there's just so many things that they're trying to juggle at once that when you're working in a larger hospital system, it's hard to really work one-on-one with patients and ensure that all of their needs are met all the time, even though all physicians are so well-intentioned and are trying to do so. So I think that it's interesting that you went into a field that already kind of steps in to fill those gaps, and through that notice like, oh, there's an even deeper issue here that now I'm passionate about really trying to solve. And I think that given that you were noticing those kind of stacking symptoms with cardiovascular health and the kind of perimenopausal symptoms, that you noticed that there was an overlap there. I'm curious to kind of dig into the relationship between the data that we have regarding women of color facing disproportionately high rates of cardiovascular disease and the kind of treatment that they receive. So to kind of give the audience a little bit of context, and all of the sources regarding this data for all of you kind of data-driven listeners will be linked in the show notes. You can do further research if you're interested. But the data is clear that women of color face disproportionately high rates of cardiovascular disease. Approximately 37 to 43% of Hispanic women in the U.S. live with cardiovascular disease. It remains the leading cause of death among Native American and Alaska Native women, who unfortunately die from it at a rate of 20 to 30% higher than non-Native women. And prevalence among non-Hispanic Asian women is as high as 45%, though this varies significantly by subgroup. So given these stark disparities in terms of the experience of cardiovascular disease and detection as well, I'm curious to understand how structural and cultural forces compound these inequities in detection and diagnosis of cardiovascular disease for women of color, immigrant women, low-income women, or those holding multiple marginalized identities. And to kind of dive deeper, when you envisioned Her Heart Co., what were the core equity gaps that you wanted to close? And how did you intentionally design the platform to meet women of all backgrounds where they are?
So I think to start, I'll kind of give a little lay of the land in terms of why we think that cardiovascular disease, based on the research that we have to this point, why cardiovascular disease is the number one killer in women, and just women as a whole. And then I think that getting into more of the systemic dismissal and the lived experience of marginalized women is something that we can go into deeper from there. To start, though, I think that it's important to frame the midlife time that we've already kind of declared as that 35 plus period of life as being a time when women actually start to lose their estrogen. And that estrogen, we often, think about estrogen, oh, it's a hormone, it is something that we live with throughout our lifetime. But what we don't often know, or are not, women are often not educated on, is that estrogen is actually a major protector of the heart. So there's a lot of crossover between hormonal health and especially this estrogen decline that happens after the age of 35 and cardiovascular disease. That protective nature, when we start to lose it, it actually leaves us more vulnerable to things like higher glucose levels, higher lipid levels. So when we go in to get our annual cholesterol testing done or something like that, we might start to see those cholesterol numbers starting to rise. We also see some of the other metabolic clues, right? We see changes in weight or shifts in weight as we go into midlife. So when we think about the kind of context of what we're dealing with in those early warning signs that a doctor may pick up on in a primary care visit, what we think about is that they are oftentimes, yes, flagged. And if they're happening in correlation with symptoms where a woman may be saying, I'm having hot flashes, or I'm having night sweats, or I'm experiencing these other things that we think of as kind of the perimenopausal symptom set that can tend to happen, what we see is that those symptoms end up being put into a category of hormonal change, aging, right? This is a natural part of life, moving through the hormonal phase. And where I think we end up losing and having women fall through the cracks is that we actually start to identify them as hormonal symptoms, but not as those cardiovascular risk factors. So we may only have one point where we say, oh, this is a cardiovascular risk factor. But actually, we may have 5 or 6 or 7, right? When you start to think about increased anxiety, hot flashes, night sweats, right? Those things that pressurize and put strain on the vascular system. So, all of that to say that if a woman is interacting with the healthcare system and having what we would call like a complexity of symptoms, right? Already that complexity of symptoms makes her less likely to get a cohesive solutions provided, right? Because of the complexity. If we
Hmm.
add to that these other factors of access to healthcare, if we add to that access to providers that speak the same language, that know also the cultural significance of hormonal change for women, which is different from one culture to the next, we start to see this piling or this layering where we find women less likely to access kind of the education and the awareness that they need to have for themselves, that these are not just hormonal changes or maybe a random glucose level getting higher, but this is a whole symptom set that is actually painting a picture of my cardiovascular risk. So when we think about dismissal, it's clinical to a degree, but it's also based off of these social and systemic larger pictures that we need to be taking into consideration. I also feel that there is a piece of this that doesn't, especially from a nutritional standpoint, right? When we start to think about the kind of common recommendation is to, exercise more, eat less, right? These things that women are told over and over again. Um, there's so many different cultural elements that come into play that need to be taken into consideration when we talk about the way that we relate to food, the cultural relevance of food. So I think that that piece is something that we as healthcare providers could do such a better job at recognizing and understanding that there's not a one size fits all recommendation that really actually serves women. When we were building Her Heart Co. and really thinking about how do we start to drive a wedge in between into this dismissal, right? How do we not allow women to fall through the cracks in their primary care visit when they're going and they're, voluntarily giving this information to their primary care provider, and that miscategorization is actually losing the opportunity to really get the cardiovascular risk picture. I think that what we wanted to design was something that both the woman could interact with from a patient platform perspective, but also where there would be a clinical tool in place that is flagging a woman at the age of 35 that is actually identifying if you're seeing high glucose or high lipids, here are other things that we need to be thinking about in terms of cardiovascular risk because of that estrogen decline. And so we wanted it to be a bidirectional tool that simultaneously could raise awareness about this hormonal cardiovascular disease connection as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting, first of all, because I wasn't privy to the knowledge that your experience as you kind of enter perimenopause and menopause, that your experience of declining estrogen not only encourages or kind of invites a varying degree of symptoms that you might want to treat on their own because they are uncomfortable with increased anxiety, hot flashes, all of those symptoms that you mentioned. But that decline in estrogen then also can increase your risk of cardiovascular disease because, like you said, estrogen is a protector of the heart. And then also, in terms of what you mentioned, in terms of the kind of cultural forces, specifically around food and the recommendations that doctors might provide to women that are entering their perimenopausal or menopausal phase, when a symptom that I think a lot of us are aware of with menopause because it's kind of forced down our throats through the media is that when you enter midlife, you likely will gain weight and you're going to want to change your appearance because you don't feel like yourself, which is a whole other thing that we could get into.
Yes.
But the recommendation that you mentioned that women across all ages are often given when they go into their healthcare provider, but specifically in midlife and in response to the symptom that I mentioned in terms of weight gain, is that the doctor might then prescribe that, okay, you need to exercise more and eat less. That also can tank your estrogen, which just increases your risk for cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular events that are unfavorable. So I really appreciate that you were so intentional in designing Her Heart Code to not only raise awareness about this intersection of hormonal health and cardiovascular health and the risks that are present in relationship to estrogen and the decline of estrogen, and then the kind of uptick in risk for cardiovascular disease, but really providing, like you mentioned, that like bidirectional support of, okay, if you're noticing this on the healthcare provider side, if you're noticing that these flags are kind of coming up in testing, it's not just, okay, let's just address those specific symptoms here. Let's look at the greater picture, because there might be a kind of two-pronged approach that we need to take in terms of addressing the perimenopausal symptoms that are frustrating for this patient to deal with, but also ensuring that their heart and their overall well-being is protected as we address both elements simultaneously. And yeah, I think that that's something that this intersectional care is something that needs to be integrated into healthcare broadly, because I think that for so many things, the mind and body are connected, the gut and brain are connected, like everything in the body is connected. Thinking about addressing something in a silo is largely likely not going to work in any capacity, but specifically here, it's speaking about cardiovascular disease. I think it's really important to think about.
Yeah, and I think that it also opens up such a great opportunity for thinking about or rethinking what we define as preventative care. And I think as women, we're often raised to, go get your pap smear, make sure you get your breast exam, go to do these things that are like these preventative screenings, right? But what we need to recognize is that there's prevention that can happen in, that a woman could have potential access to herself, right? So when I think about like a data driven approach to cardiovascular disease, which is a big part of what we were really trying to build with Her Heart Co, is how do we actually use technology that's already out there, that's already available, things like continuous glucose monitors, wearable devices. So thinking about, a Fitbit or an Apple Watch that a woman may already have, or, in a perfect world could get rented out of her clinician's office to be able to actually start to get those relevant data points. And I say relevant because they're not absolute, right? They're not necessarily what you would get from a blood draw or a lab report, but they're relevant to how you feel. They're relevant to how are you validating your symptoms. If, say, you're not sleeping and then the next day you notice that your blood sugars are rising higher and higher, right? You start to see these relevant correlations in your own symptoms and your own data points that I think that is an incredibly important bridge that we have access to, but that we're not using enough in terms of women's health. And because of the disparities in terms of the medical education about women's health and how to actually serve women better, especially in this midlife stage, I think that we really need to have that integrative approach that also brings in the technology, the wearable data that actually helps women to have that preventative monitoring to be able to make those choices and those changes that are much more precise and much more personalized to what's going on in her body.
Hmm.
And when we think about the preventative side of things, a woman's ability to intake data, be aware of what it means, to think about, well, what is one thing I might be able to change, and then monitor that over 2 to 3 weeks, and how does that change my data point, right? We have such a huge opportunity for how we can start to rethink preventative medicine at this time that actually I believe could allow women's health to be on a forefront of that curve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of harkens back to some of the disparities that we talked about in terms of the data, in terms of the difference in diagnoses and detection and experience of cardiovascular disease across women of color as compared to white women. Because the reality, which you pointed to earlier in this conversation, is that women of color often face dismissal in healthcare settings, which, combined with historic and ongoing medical mistrust, can make it incredibly difficult to have their symptoms taken seriously. So if women of all backgrounds had access to a data-driven approach, like a wearable device that they could use to track their symptoms and then bring that information to their healthcare providers, that data, I think, could then serve as a tangible way to demonstrate what they're experiencing, showing correlations between their symptoms and, for example, their dips in hormone levels. And I think that what was so powerful about Her Heart Co is that when that data is then paired with the education that Her Heart Co was aiming to provide in terms of helping women understand that changes in estrogen during perimenopause or menopause can increase cardiovascular risk, I feel that that would have empowered women to advocate for themselves in medical settings. They could say, this is what I'm experiencing, and this is how it connects to my hormonal changes, and this is why I need support. So having that combination of data and knowledge would have helped to help mitigate the dismissal women of color often face and close equity gaps in care by giving them the tools to ensure their symptoms are validated and acted upon. I think that it does have the power to help with ensuring that more women don't fall through the cracks because they have that data to show, like, these symptoms are correlated with dip in my hormones as I enter this stage of my life, but this is also increasing my risk for cardiovascular disease. So I want support in terms of ensuring that I can protect and prevent myself from experiencing the onset of cardiovascular disease and the downturn of my health overall. I think that idea of creating an integrated platform to provide women with as much data as possible really does help to drive progress towards closing those equity gaps. And I think that that's really powerful.
And I think that there's such a good use case in terms of when we think about the use of CGMs or continuous glucose monitors were always an integral part of what we built at Her Heart Co. Because when we think about CGMs, they're often used in the diabetic space. They're prescribed, they're covered by insurance, in the diabetic space. But as a clinician, specifically working with women over the years, what you find is that if you can monitor and actually rebalance or find a balanced pattern with blood sugar regulation, you actually see this downstream effect of hormonal balance as well and less hormonal symptoms. And I think that when we ran our pilot program for Her Heart Co, that was one of the biggest things that we saw is, women were much better able to make decisions on their nutritional input. They were able to fuel themselves better, the right quantities of food, right? Like all of these things that help their blood sugar stabilize. And we saw that decrease in hormonal symptoms as well. And so to think about, again, we're not trying to recreate the wheel or build a hardware here. We're trying to say these are tools that are already out there, already available for the CGMs, already in the medical stream.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just advocating for them to be used in women's health. So a woman going through perimenopause could just as easily walk into the clinic and get a prescription and an insurance covered CGM in order to regulate her symptoms, as a diabetic or a pre-diabetic would be able to.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really about just equipping everyone across a spectrum of diagnoses, symptoms with all of the relevant information that they need to best be able to support themselves as they, like, kind of in between their visits with their provider of, like, how do I leverage the data that already exists if I'm able to have access to a wearable device or a CGM to really integrate and understand that data for myself to then make informed decisions about how to best fuel myself, how to best ensure that I'm getting quality sleep, etc., to then support my body as it moves through these hormonal shifts as I enter this stage of my life, which ultimately, as we've discussed, has a ripple effect on your prevention and protection from cardiovascular disease. So I think the power of data is very clear. And I am very inspired by the mission of Her Heart Co to really deliver that to everyone. And I think that kind of leads us into this third question that I'm excited to dive into, because it's clear that Her Heart Co was deeply intentional in its mission. And I understand now that you've made the difficult decision to dissolve the venture in its current format. So I'm interested to know what challenges you faced in trying to solve such a systemic problem through the startup model, and where do you maybe see room for iteration and improvement in future solutions?
I know, just even talking to you about Her Heart Co, I still am so excited about it, and I am still so close to this pivot of dissolving the company in the last few months. And so I think that it's a good example of how you, when you speak about something and you know it from a clinical perspective and you're excited for the possibility of it, you drive excitement and enthusiasm around it. There were so many green lights for us as a company that were like, yes, build this, do this, move forward with this, right? This is such a need. And there's such an open space for innovation in cardiovascular disease prevention. And really, in real time, we need a solution, right? We need something that's catching women and detecting this earlier and really registering their risk factors appropriately. And so when I think about all of those green lights over, we worked on the project for about 2.5 years. We found that women really are ready for a tool like this. We found clinicians that were really excited to get behind this idea and move it forward. We found partners in research that were really excited to be able to dig into getting the data. But really, over the course of 2.5 years, though we had a lot of really positive traction, moments where things were moving forward, ultimately, when we began and were incubated, we got an amount of pre-seed funding which we used to run our initial pilot. And that put us on the track of venture capital. That put us on the track of being a venture-backed startup moving forward into the ecosystem. And over time, we really realized that the amount of research that we would have to do, the amount of trial work that would have to be done in order to have this even enter the pathway towards becoming a medical device that could be used by a clinician. We're talking, 3 to 5 to 7 years in some people's cases in terms of that runway. And that's not to mention the amount of financial capital that you need before that validation is completed in order to get more funding to actually bring it to market. And so we really were so committed to Her Heart not just becoming another app, and not just becoming another wellness app in the women's health world, actually becoming a clinical tool and a medical, something that could be used for medical diagnostics. Because at its core, it was a scoring system. So when a woman goes in to get her cardiovascular risk assessed, are all these other things being taken into account? And the answer is no, right? She's actually automatically given a lower score for cardiovascular risk just because she's a woman.
Mm.
And there's definitely not this extra layer of looking at her hormonal health history and her reproductive history being taken into account. So when we think about the amount of validation that this idea needed to be able to go all the way through to market, to be able to be used by clinicians in that setting, we really felt that there was a mismatch between what was expected from a venture investment side of things and what we had as a financial runway to get there. In terms of, you know, iterations and improvement. I think you said this so well at the beginning of this call, is thinking about it in terms of what do you do when you're so close to it and you're so close to the idea, but also to, the research that you've done along the way, the partnerships and the collaborations that you've picked up along the way. Over the course of 2.5 years, you meet with so many people and you talk about this with so many people. So what do we do with that? And I think that for me, what I realized is that we really need, there's quite a few things that gave us signals that the market was just not ready. Though parts of the technology are there, there's a lot of technological gaps in terms of the EHRs and how they actually uptake data from wearable devices. And then also that we're dealing with consumer wearables and trying to make them clinically relevant. And there's a big gap there in terms of what is FDA approved, what is not FDA approved. And though I would say that cardiovascular disease is probably like on the cutting edge of what we're going to see in that trend with some of the features in Apple Watch, and we see things coming through for cardiovascular disease all the time, getting FDA approval. I think that the actual infrastructure needs a lot more entrepreneurial impact to be able to be prepared for the system that we wanted to build.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think from what I've learned about your journey, I really do see Her Heart Co. as a bold and necessary intervention in the women's health space, one that sought to close long ignored gaps in cardiovascular care and reimagine what equity-centered innovation could look like. And so I'm curious to kind of dig in. You talked about this a little bit in terms of having Her Heart Co. kind of operate in the startup world and leveraging VC funding. I'm curious to kind of explore more of the how behind building Her Heart Co. and how you procured early traction and what you might have done differently with hindsight now, and how your support network shaped your ability to recognize when it was time to pivot. Given that the venture is dissolving in its current form, I also want to explore what it means to evolve with your mission and what this chapter is teaching you about resilience, responsibility, and continuing the work that you're passionate about in new ways. And for all of you routine-oriented listeners, the how questions are going to look a little bit different in this episode, but I know Frankie's insights here are going to provide so much value. So to just kind of dive right in our introductory conversation, you said something that really stuck with me, that in women's health, we can't move fast and break things. So I'm curious if you can kind of unpack that idea for our listeners here.
Yeah, so I think that that's such a great identifier in terms of what happens when you're trying to innovate within healthcare versus when you're trying to build a new gadget that's going to be out on the market, right? We have to be so thoughtful about the clinical validation and the clinical partnerships that kind of fuel that innovation along the way that we collaborate from the research side and into the clinical environment. We have to be making sure that we are doing things in a way that actually are going to have positive outcomes and impacts on the patient at the end of the day. And the speed at which venture capital really pushes early traction, right? Necessarily line up with all the time that we're trying to make up for in women's health research. So specifically for women's health research, there's a lot, but there's a lot that we don't have, and there's a lot that we need, and there's a lot of catching up for that lost time that we're trying to do as we're also flying the plane. And so when you are innovating in this space, I think that there's a different model that we can really start to envision that would better serve women's health innovation, to be able to give women the access to more collaboration so that the research is being done, but it's being done based off of the clinical gaps that are missing, right? And that we're actually doing research that's going to feed into the innovation loop, right? So, how are we letting clinical need inform research, and how are we letting that research search then inform the way that we're able to move faster down the medical device path or faster down the medical innovation path? So that we're not trying to wear all the hats and do all the things and be the researcher and be the clinician and be the entrepreneur all at the same time, right? So that we can have these better networks. And this is where I get hopeful in that the women's health ecosystem could actually be a model for this type of more regenerative, kind of like integrative innovation as we move forward. It could be a real model for how do we do this and have collaboration at the core a little bit more than disruption. And that's a belief that I have that we might see that in the coming years, right? As we see women know this need so strongly and also have such a tight ecosystem building around this right now. For us, the early traction for those that are out there, wanting to get into the space, wanting to think about, how do I get started? How do I start to get things moving. I have this idea or I see this need. For us, the traction really came from early support in, as I already mentioned, and we were a part of a women's health incubator that we went through. And then we also became part of the National Science Foundation's I-Core program. And at the time, in the first year of the initiative, I was also a student in the Masters of Health Administration program at the University of Washington. So I had access to a lot of kind of cross-departmental networks that were able to help us with our MVP. We were a part of an amazing program with the University of Washington's informatics program, which allowed us to build an MVP over the course of 6 months of working together with a team of students. And that kind of traction is often hard to come by if you're just on a solo journey outside of the university environment. But because we had access to some of those resources, it made it a lot more possible for us to tap into other teams that could help us with the tech side of things when we were definitely more clinically based. And I think that, once you have that MVP, you have something that you can actually put out there and you can show how it works. And what we did with that was our initial pilot program. So we actually, ran a very small, like friends and family cohort of 12 women. And we had them use wearables and we had them go through the interventions that we recommended in these 6 specific categories over the course of 3 months. And that was small but mighty, and it's something that I would highly recommend to anybody that's trying to make this jump from a clinical insight into the world of an innovation is start small and don't be afraid that it's too small because it gives you confidence to be able to grow. It gives you confidence to be able to put the data to be able to look at the data, analyze the data, see the real time changes. And it is the best green light for moving forward, right? Like if you can see that and you can track it appropriately and monitor that appropriately, and also get the feedback from those early fans and early adopters, it's so important for that early traction.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you said a lot there that I think we should dive into. I think your initial point about VC funding really being about garnering that early traction and leveraging it as quickly as possible, and that specifically not being suited to healthcare innovation for women and the responsibility that's required in terms of making sure that we can marry research and clinical innovation with innovation in terms of medical wearables like you're talking about, or innovation that is more customer facing or consumer facing. And so I think, and I agree with you in terms of what you were saying, that women's health innovation can serve as a model for what's possible when we lead with the research and we acknowledge that like this needs to be addressed first and in conjunction with innovation in terms of like building the actual product or the MVP or whatever the case is. But we need to ensure that all appropriate steps are being taken to allow for these equity gaps that we're acknowledging that we started this venture to solve are actually being addressed through research, or we have all of the information necessary from clinical research to better inform how to build our solution to actually serve the needs of the community that we're trying to serve. And I think when money does get involved and investors want to see a return on the investment that they're making in you, of course, it makes sense that they want that quickly. With health in general, but specifically women's health, as we've discussed throughout this episode, it's very layered that your hormonal health can have a direct impact on your cardiovascular health and risk factors for cardiovascular disease. We have to acknowledge that like innovation needs to be nuanced and their research needs to be involved in that process. So I think that thinking about women's health innovation as an incubator for this new kind of collaborative model for funding and for driving innovation is really exciting. And I think that hopefully we will, and maybe you already have, but hopefully we will start to see kind of emerging examples of what's possible here.
I think an important part of that vision of a more collaborative approach is just to imagine the difference of, co-founder team or two, a founder with maybe, a CTO or something like that versus like what happens if innovation was being born out of a room that had a clinician, a researcher, a payer representative, right? When we think about what is the ROI, we need to be thinking about reimbursement within the healthcare system and how that is a totally different pathway than thinking about ROI in terms of, a consumer pathway. And that can be such a hard world to break into, and such a difficult world to navigate. And I think that, kind of thinking about those collaborative webs is kind of being like the birthplace of the innovation, so that we actually have the right people at the table.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that expanding the network in terms of whose brains can we put together to best solve this issue and ensuring that everybody is feeling like they can meaningfully and equally contribute to this solution that everyone is passionate about is really important. And getting investors to acknowledge that every person here is a really important part of the puzzle, including you, including the ones that are investing. Not a kind of power dynamic of we're working on this thing and we need you to help us fund it, but rather we are all interested, passionate about, and curious about how to solve this equity gap and this problem. How do we see ourselves as a collective team where the funding is important, the actual like brains working on the solution are important in an equal capacity? Yeah, I think that's really that is a model of capital funding that I am inspired by and that I hope that we start to see more. To kind of pivot a little bit, pivoting is one of the hardest things a founder can do, especially when you're deeply invested in the problem that you're trying to solve. So, can you talk about the role that your support network played in helping you recognize that it was time to step back from Her Heartco or shift?
I think that's one of the most important things that you have to learn as a founder is that you have to know when to kill something. And it sounds so rough and it sounds so direct, but it's true. I mean, I think that especially, as a clinician, when your heart is in it and you're so close to it and you've seen the problem and how it's played out for so many years, and it becomes very difficult to actually acknowledge that the timing might just not be right. Or in the case of a lot of great ideas, other players are on the scene and they're really well funded, right? And it's about like recognizing that, especially in women's health, especially in female founders, there's a very small amount of venture capital that is going to fund a female founder, and therefore then in women's health we're a percentage of that VC funding, right? So that there are going to be in some realms competitors that come onto the landscape and are able to acquire funding a lot faster. And you could be doing all the right things. You could be deep into the research. You could be with all of the right collaborative partners. And if that funding is not available or that box has already been checked in terms of, some of the bigger players in the funding world, that's important to recognize, like when to call it.
Hmm.
I think that for me, recognizing that the world of, as I've said already, the collaboration became um, more exciting to me than feeling like I needed to build something new and different. And I felt like though it had a lot of traction, Her Heart Faux, again, it was not the right timing. The infrastructure wasn't there to actually see it through to fruition in a timeline that worked for our own personal financial viability. So knowing when to be able to kind of like come out of your tunnel vision and look around and reassess the landscape and reassess, where the technology is, where the collaborative partners are, I think is just a constant thing to practice as an entrepreneur. You're constantly zooming really far in on your project, and then you have to be able to zoom out and really continue to look at a market analysis of what's happening, where are things going, especially in these times when technology is so rapidly changing. Like, just to think about the trends of AI in the last 2.5 years when we were developing, and the many different iterations that we thought about, came across, discussed with different leaders in the field. And I think that's not going anywhere, right? We're only going to see technology continue to expand and develop at such a rapid rate, more and more and more. And so we do need to be able to ask ourselves, like, as there's more and more pieces of the puzzle already laid out on the table, where are we able to use our entrepreneurial skill to be more collaborative instead of necessarily needing to be the one or the new idea or the new product on the market? I think those are really, really important questions to ask ourselves.
Yeah, I think that segues really perfectly into the next question that I had for you in terms of what this experience has really taught you about being a founder and how it's reshaped your understanding of the intersection of healthcare and entrepreneurship. And I think you were kind of about to dive into this, but how it's emboldened you to keep moving forward and encourage others to do the same. Because I think what I'm hearing you say is that it's so important to be cognizant of the landscape that you're operating in, and also acknowledge that even though the solution that you're working on developing, that you're so close to it, you're so passionate about it, it's perhaps less important to be the one, like you just mentioned, like driving the innovation and be at the forefront of it and be the kind of top competitor in that space. But it's what perhaps is more important is your commitment to the problem at large, and figuring out how, even if your initial idea didn't pan out the way that you had expected it to, or you may have wanted it to, that it doesn't mean that you have to stop working on solving that problem. So yeah, I'm curious to kind of hear your perspective on that as well.
Well, I think in our case, what I did was really look at, like, what are the barriers and the enablers that are present. And I think that when I looked at the barriers and I looked at, kind of this list of things that were kind of getting in our way from an infrastructure perspective or kind of a larger healthcare system perspective, I began to see that at each one of those barriers had such an opportunity for an entrepreneurial mind to be a part of that conversation and to be a part of that. So take the EHR piece, for example, right? Um, EHRs were a huge, issue, like, in terms of how is an EHR going to connect to a wearable, and if that wearable is not a medical device, right? Like, these kind of downstream effects that we were starting to run into in terms of the compounding barriers. Uh, but think about, you know, working for a company that is an EHR company, that is a company that is, the company that probably, provides the EHRs for 65% of clinical practice, not hospital practice, but clinical providers, right? Like, where could an entrepreneur be so useful in that space inside, like, as an entrepreneur inside of, what do we think of as EHRs? What do we think of as this time that we're living in terms of wearable devices? What do we think about these different protocols that need to be coming forward in terms of women's health? And that's just one example where you take one barrier and you actually follow that thread and you say, where is the entrepreneurial mindset actually going to be really useful here? And I think that that's what I'm excited about, as, like, even if an initiative closes or an initiative dissolves, you are still an entrepreneur and you still have that mindset and you still have that ability to think creatively and to think about how to be in the room with the right people having the right conversations in order to maybe move a piece of the puzzle forward, if not, the whole piece forward at the same time.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective that you or the entrepreneurial skill set that you already brought to the table in developing Her Heart Co, but the entrepreneurial skill set that you honed through that experience is not lost. It's something that you can continue to leverage and use in this space, but also in, say that you become passionate about another healthcare issue or a health concern that pertains to women or midlife women specifically, that there's barriers in that space as well that you can then apply the skill set and the entrepreneurial mindset that you already have and that you've continued to hone through your previous experiences to better help you devise solutions that are all encompassing and that acknowledge all of the layers and elements that need to be addressed to ensure that women are best served across differences of race, class, ethnicity, etc. So I really appreciate that perspective. And I think that that's valuable for listeners to hear, that it's not, again, like it's not a failure. It's a learning, and it's about leveraging what you have experienced and learned through a particular experience in new ways, in new experiences moving forward.
Absolutely. And one of my mentors said something. He's like, the curse of creative people is that you have to become extremely good at discerning, right?
Mm,
Because when you are an entrepreneur and you are creative and you are able to look at things and assess problems and think of the solutions, right? Like you have to become so good at being able to discern where to put your energy and where that energy is actually going to be able to get the most traction. And I think that there is a lot to be said for looking at the ways that things are used and working well, and actually asking those questions of what can we learn from that in order to adopt it in a new space, or what can we learn from how that is going and maybe tweak it or work it a little bit differently. In our case, a really good example of that was looking at, in clinical trials or in research, wearables are being used all the time, right? They're being used for population health. They're being used to monitor participants in clinical trials. And so thinking about like, where can we look to see like what's working over here, and actually what are the things that we've learned over here that could actually be better used in this new use case. And again, that's part of that like skill of zooming out and being able to
mhm.
look at things and reassess and look at, not become so consumed with what it is that we're doing, but actually continue to look at what's being built around us.
Yeah, yeah, I really love what your mentor shared with you in terms of the curse of being creative is having to be discerning. And I think that that's a privilege to recognize that you have such a creative mind that you can see and begin to envision solutions to numerous problems. And you have to be discerning in terms of where do I want to start, but also be discerning in terms of recognizing the landscape that you're operating in, and where do I and my skill set slot in, and how can I make the most meaningful change now? And then if that doesn't work, how do I pivot and try again? So I think everything that we've talked about today has provided such valuable insight to me, but I know that all of the listeners listening are walking away with so much insight in terms of what it means to follow the entrepreneurial journey from start, not necessarily finish, but the middle of like, okay, now where am I going with what I've learned? And acknowledging that, like we've mentioned before, that just because the initial idea and initial innovation didn't pan out the way that you would have perhaps liked it to because of funding constraints or external circumstances, it doesn't mean that the work is done. And it only means that you can leverage what you have learned through this experience in new and innovative ways. And that's really exciting. So I'm very excited to see what you do in this space. And I am looking forward to kind of following along. And I'm sure that the listeners will too. And I just want to thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your story. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Kelen.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast. The Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast was founded, hosted, and produced by me, Kelen Tamurian, president of the We Lead Student Board, with support from the Burke Center for Entrepreneurship in the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington. I'm so grateful to have you along for these conversations, amplifying the stories of impact-minded women and gender-expansive innovators whose ventures and life's work shine a bright light on the radical possibility of entrepreneurship as an engine for positive social impact. If you'd like to learn more about the entrepreneur or leader featured in this episode, their journey, business, and mission, be sure to check out their website and social media platforms, all linked in the show notes. There you'll also find a list of the statistics, articles, and resources mentioned in this conversation for your further research and exploration. To stay connected with the Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast and the Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership Program at the Burke Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Washington, follow us on social media and visit our website, both linked below. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review, and share the podcast with a friend, classmate, or fellow believer in the power of entrepreneurship to spark positive change. Your support truly means the world and is the best way to help grow the show. I'm so happy you're here and part of the Her Entrepreneurial Rise community. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.